Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 23 of the Snake in the Draft podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vines. You can find me on Twitter at jsnake_DFF. In this episode, I have Michael Royer, a.k.a. at Dynasty_DadFF on Twitter. Coming on the podcast, you should be following him. He is the host of the Dynasty Dad Pod and Dynasty Refinery. He is also a writer for Dynasty HH Pod. Today we're going to talk about Superflex Dynasty strategy from the startup to the next offseason, which I know everybody's heard the last couple of podcasts talking about Dynasty strategy. So this is just going to continue to build on it because I think we need to have a nice, well-rounded perspective of different strategies. So welcome, Mike. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show, Jacob. I'm really looking forward to it. This is the time of year where literally we have to talk about those kind of strategies. I just was talking to Scott Connor, and I feel like the better, more eclectic approach you have of listening to different analysts talk about their draft strategies and the way they go about the offseason, the more you as a listener put that together, you form your own, percentages of how you do things. And it's best to kind of get your own approach.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I know I was talking to John Hogue a little while ago, and I mentioned to him how I'm even still personally working on my Superflex Dynasty strategy because there's just so many different ways to think about it. And I haven't had a super long-standing league to really be able to dig deep and actually decide what my own strategy is. So yeah, I'm excited to hear what your strategy is. But before we get to that, I have one question that I ask every guest, and that is, what is one hobby that you really enjoy doing that does not relate to fantasy football?
All right. So I am the Dynasty dad, and the biggest and most exciting part of my life is being a dad. I know that's kind of a cheat code answer here, but I mean, I have 4 kids, 7, 9, 11, and 13, and just playing video games with them, playing sports in the backyard, just soaking up every possible minute is my hobby, and I mean, aside from fantasy football, they're pretty much everything is super important to me right now. And I can't, put anything else above that.
Yeah, love it. What video games are y'all playing?
Right now, they're totally into Fortnite. Like
Okay.
my youngest is into Super Smash Brothers. I always dominate them in Madden, but I think they get tired of that. Like I'm the dad who lets them get super close and then crushes their dreams at the end because I'm not about to lose. But they're
No.
totally into Fortnite right now, and I'm trying to get better at it. But it's a little bit more challenging. I grew up in the NES, like I'm old enough to remember that was my system, and I got that upstairs still, my original one. So like Mario and all that kind of stuff, I dominate. But when it comes to some of these new first person shooters and things like that, it takes a little bit of work, but I'm working on it.
It takes a ton of work. I actually got really into Fortnite in college, which was like 2 or 3 years ago, and I got decent at it. But for me, it's the whole building aspect that just was so difficult. And I bet that's what you're struggling with too.
Yeah. Because I'm used to, when I was in college, SOCOM was out, and I'm so used to hunting people down and attacking from that angle. And my son, I mean, he almost wins every time he plays. Like he's won some tournaments. He's 13. He's phenomenal at the game. And me, I'm like, I just go attack people. I'm not trying to build. I was like, I'm not into Minecraft. They were into that. I'm like, I just want to play. I want some action.
Yeah, you should get him into. There's a other game called Apex Legends that I think would be more your speed. It's like a Halo Fortnite combo, and there's no building.
There you go. I might have
I don't know.
It'll give me more an advantage. I love it.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go ahead and dig into Superflex Dynasty strategy. And we're going to start with the startup. So my first question is, do you draft to win now, be more in like a productive struggle, or somewhere in between?
Okay. That changes. Every Superflex draft is completely different. So yeah, I feel like when you're in a 1 quarterback league, which I haven't done one of those for a while, but it's so vanilla and everything, you got your ADP there and you don't differentiate a lot. There's not a big run on a position you're not expecting. People go in generally 6 to 8, maybe 10 spots in difference. But in Superflex, you got to roll with the punches. You got to understand that sometimes they're going to go super heavy. And I personally kind of adapt to it as I go. Last year, I was in a draft where I knew this running back class was going to be phenomenal. And what I did was a year 1 punt. And basically, I was taking young quarterbacks, young wide receivers. I punted the running back class completely. And I accumulated 7 first-round picks by moving back consistently every round. I'm like, who wants it? And when you set the tone on that early, that's something that you're willing to do, teams come to you and they're trying to move up. And that's where when teams are super aggressive, they're trying to move up there, and that's how you accumulate value. Like I kept moving back every single round and picking up players that I thought were, high upside that could get to that same draft spot. So if I'm trading back from 205 to to 308, I'm taking a guy who I think is going to be in that same area. But now what I call it, and I talk about this all the time on the Dynasty Refinery, is an insulated trade or insulated risk, where you move back from that 205 where you might have got Chris Godwin, you move back to 308, take AJ Brown and get a first on top of it.
Yeah,
So,
I love that strategy.
It's and then recently I did FFPC Pros versus Joes. I was honored to be in that with Curtis Patrick, guys from Goat District, Nick BDGE, like some big time names in there. And I ended up with, I had the 104 and I got Saquon. And now I'm like, so I feel like your first pick pretty much dictates how you're going to go. For me, once I got Saquon Barkley and then I ended up getting Joe Mixon in the second round, then I became a win now team. And I feel like you almost have to be able to be fluid in all of your drafts. You can't sit there and say, I'm going all in right off the bat. You got to take the value where it hits you.
Yeah, that's a great point, because there was 2 different Superflex Dynasty drafts I was in this offseason, and there was one to where there was 20 QBs that were drafted in the first 5 rounds, and then another one, which this is mostly new people to Superflex. It's my new home Dynasty league. It's with some friends and family. There was only 7 quarterbacks drafted in the first 5 rounds. So
that's the difference. Is if you're in an industry league or a Twitter league or guys that are knowledgeable and really getting that information out there, they go heavy. I mean, I've been in some 12 and 14. I was in a Dynasty Happy Hour versus Dynasty Nerds draft. Also, I did 5 this offseason. And they're all super flex. And in that particular one, it was 14 team and the quarterbacks flew off the board. By the time the 3rd round was over, there was 8 starting quarterbacks left, so it's just, you gotta be able to adapt and you got to roll with it. And then your newer, Dynasty owners, they're really, for the most part, sit back and wait on those quarterbacks because they're so used to one quarterback league and they're not quite sure where to go with that. So I like to think outside the box. I like to zig when other people zag, and you have to really, that's how you create positional advantages. That's how you put yourself in a position where you're always just striving for as much value. And what I really try to do in drafts, I want to make sure I get at least 3 to 4 quarterbacks, but I'm trying to gain as much value. People in the offseason really start to say, well, I didn't have a running back this round, so I stretched or I reached on James Conner. No, you don't have to start James Conner in February, right? He's only going to depreciate in value. So take those wide receivers in that same round and, build up that value and make it a trade market, because I love to trade.
Isn't it Dynasty Outhouse that says draft best player available? Isn't that his main quote?
Yes, we were talking about that last night. We talked about that a lot, and we talked about Superflex rankings and really, take that best player every single time. And we talked about a lot of these things, and I think they're universal truths when it comes to your draft. And I find the reason I started Dynasty Refinery and Dynasty Dad podcast was to teach people that, how to do these kind of things and give lessons on, I did a lesson on rebuild. I'm going to do a lesson on startups. That way people can have an idea of what they need to do.
Yeah, I was going to mention that rebuild podcast, a couple of podcasts that you had, because I listened to them and they were fantastic, because there's a couple leagues that I'm in a rebuild and I listen to it. And if anybody thinks they know more than someone else, just listen to anybody else's information, because you're going to learn a couple things. And you did a great job of breaking it down and talking about, it's been a little while, but just sort of how to build your team up from the bottom, which I think is really important. And we'll get into that a little bit today, but yeah, those are some great podcasts. I'll definitely put that on the show sheet for sure and find those, because those are well done.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think the one thing that I try to break it down and show the trades that I make, talk about it step by step. And the 2 things that I try to do when I talk about rebuilding that I don't hear a lot of other podcasts do is, number one, that splash trade. So many teams, I want to be top 3, I want to be bottom 3, but they sit on the fence and they don't make that splash trade. They don't make that trade where I'm like, now I'm all the way committed to the rebuild. And then the other one is, I like to create positional deficiencies. I hate tanking. I hate the word tanking. I hate the idea of tanking. I've played in leagues last year where a guy benched Devontae Adams and DeAndre Hopkins the last 6 weeks of the season. I hate that. It ruins the league. So what I do is, like I talked about in that punt, I didn't start any running backs that were worthwhile the entire season, but I still started the best players on my team.
Yep. And that's a great point, because a lot of people think tanking is playing worse players or trading away really good players so that you're not playing players that are going to score a lot of points. But the only point that I would consider tanking in a rebuild that gets a little wishy-washy for me is if someone, say, trades away all their starting quarterbacks, and so they don't even have a starting quarterback left on their roster. And that to me gets wishy-washy because then you're not starting a full roster.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I was still starting, players that were playing, it's not
Yeah.
that I feel like do not trade all your quarterbacks in a super flex because it's going to be so much more expensive to buy them back. But yeah, I know what you're
Yeah.
saying.
And that was from someone posted it on Twitter, and they were talking about someone said that this team was going too far in tanking, and their best quarterback and their only really potential starting quarterback was Justin Herbert. And I was just like, that to me is going too far because you won't be able to start a quarterback most likely for 4 to 6 weeks, maybe the whole season. But I
Right.
do completely agree with get rid of those running backs, get rid of those high end guys. Well, if you want to keep some of the younger ones, of course you can, but get rid of the Devontae Adams, trade them away, get your A.J. Brown plus a 2021 first and maybe a 2022 first on top and build your team up that way because I'm doing a rebuild. My top running backs were Darius Geis and Damian Harris. And so now it's like Damian Harris and like Lamar Miller. So
Yeah.
like
And that's
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 just who
fine
it
because
is.
that's gonna put you in that 101 race, and that's where you want to be. And to the point you said, those insulated trades, trading it's retooling a little bit sometimes, or just moving down where you take DeAndre Hopkins. And in a recent trade, I traded DeAndre Hopkins for DK Metcalf and the 105 in a rookie draft, and I took J.K. Dobbins. I mean, that's how you win: is you take those studs that are starting to depreciate, you sell them before they get to that point, and that's how you win it.
Yeah, I love that move. My last question related to the startup draft is how do you balance youth and vets in a dynasty startup? And I've heard some people say just draft the youth early and draft vets later. Is that similar to what you do, or do you do something a little bit different?
No, I agree with that. I think in the beginning you have to draft your cornerstones. You have to draft those guys where I don't like taking Julio Jones in the first couple rounds because I like my first 5 rounds. I want guys that have a nice solid floor, but they can appreciate in value. I do not like taking DeAndre Hopkins or Devontae Adams in that first, second round range because they're going to depreciate after this year. They're going to be 28. It's going to be on the downward. I prefer moving back as much as possible, accumulating value, but taking those young guys early and then move back and start to pick up some of them vets and fill in some of those holes, and there's so much value that can be had later because when people gets to round 7, 8, 9, they want to take the high upside guys then, and there's a lot of positional value that falls.
Yeah. And one good point to mention that you just alluded to is the idea of once players reach a certain age, it's not necessarily their production is going to fall off, but the value in the dynasty community is going to make their value just decrease. Like, yeah, once players hit 28, once running backs start hitting that 25, 26, they may still produce for a couple more years, but you are stuck with them. Like Julio Jones, for the amount of production he's going to provide for this year and next year, you should just keep him on your team unless you're needing to go into a rebuild because he's going to provide production similar to a Devontae Adams, but his age is what just hinders that value completely.
Yeah, and what you do with that is like when you're trading back from those guys. I love DeAndre Hopkins, I love Devontae Adams, I love Julio Jones. In a redraft, give me all those guys possible. But if I trade back like I talked about with DeAndre Hopkins, and I got J.K. Dobbins and DK Metcalf. If I want DeAndre Hopkins next year, guess what? He's cheaper, and I still came out on top. Like I'm getting those two players that I love, and I could probably trade one of them back for him next year because that's where the value is going to start to go. And you upgraded there, and you can buy him cheaper the next year.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. So now we're going to go to the in-season dynasty strategy. And my first question is, do you do anything unique in the season to set yourself apart in dynasty? Some examples are trading for injured players or trading away vets on a hot streak.
I believe and I subscribe completely to buy low, sell high. So I am buying guys that are at a risk. I bought Tyreek Hill shares everywhere, and I was not happy with what he did. Don't get me wrong, but I don't like to always look at them as players. I look at them as shares, or I look at them as that's an asset. It's more like a stock market, and I know there's some negative stuff going around with that, but like
Yeah, I would say just
it's a
think about it
game.
like a portfolio.
Yes, I like that better. But what I like to do is I like to, take risks on those kind of guys. And when there's players that are veterans that I don't believe in, when they have a good game, when John Ross or Sammy Watkins put up 40-point games last year, I was trying to sell them to anybody that was believing, So that's what you got to do in Dynasty. And it's very team dependent. A guy might start out, let's say Leonard Fournette starts out in a bad streak with the first like 5-6 games, but you believe in him, you can buy him at a discount, and there's streaks of 4 or 5 games where people really start to hit the panic button way too early.
Yeah, so one example of a player that I'm actually leaning towards becoming a dynasty buy for me is David Montgomery, actually, which he recently had the scary news with.
Yeah.
He left the field on a cart, but luckily it's looking like it's just like a soft tissue hip injury, or was it hip flexor injury, I think? I don't know, something like
Yeah,
that, groin
the
injury.
groin flex. Yeah, it's great.
So
Groin strain.
so maybe 4 weeks and maybe longer, but once that weeks come for any team that I'm like more of that retooling, rebuilding team, I think he's a decent grab. And I know a lot of people aren't super high on him because he wasn't that efficient, but I just think with his age, with the amount of usage that he receives, if you
Yeah.
can get him relatively cheap, why not?
Yeah, in Dynasty, trading players when they're injured or trading for players when they're injured is fantastic in a rebuild. I mean, last year someone really wanted a tight end. I had Gerald Everett, and he gave me Preston Williams when he got hurt, and a second round pick on top of it for Gerald Everett in the third. So it's like I get a player I believe in so much more, but he's not going to help that guy. And you can't just sit back in Dynasty. You can't let it play out. You need to be aggressive. And when you see a guy gets injured, wait a couple of days and make an offer and say, hey, I'm willing to trade you this guy off my team who's going to help you right off the bat.
Yeah, like one example, and this is more towards like an off-season trade, but I sent a random trade, just a cold trade, 2020 thirds for Tom Brady. And that's before he signed with the Buccaneers, and
Yeah.
they accepted it in a Superflex. And that's one of those things that
Ooh, that's beautiful.
I know, and it's one of those things that some people say, well, that's a low ball offer. You don't want to do that. But sometimes you just offer trades and you just see what happens. And if you're doing a rebuild, you have to be even more active than if your team is a contending team, because you have to find the value. You have to sort of get little value here and there. You got to trade for the picks. You got to move picks around the rookie draft maybe to get some players to make a push. But yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I across my leagues last year, I made 127 trades. So I love making trades. I love getting those little trades, even if it's just on a rebuild, trading Adrian Peterson in a third for a second, because he does no good for your team in a rebuild, or little things like that where you just make small trades, but they can add up to big things where, that particular trade that ended up being Brian Edwards because I moved into a region where I was able to draft a player that I love.
Nice. So with in season, there's always that time of when do you go to look to push for a championship, or you just realize this isn't my year and I either need to retool or rebuild. Is there a certain week that you sort of look to realize that, or is it maybe once you're at a certain record, or what do you look for?
I think the first 4 weeks are really telling. That gives you an idea of where you're at. You're understanding if you're going to be competing or not. By week 8, I feel like if you're going to make the playoffs or not. Week 8 for me is like, most of my leagues only go to week 13, then we start the playoffs. So I got 5 weeks. Now I have an idea of, do I need to go 4-1? That's a lot more risky of a play. Do I need to go 5-0, or is it a team where, that week 8 for me just seems like the time. And that's when you can really start to add value to your team for next year or make a push for that playoff spot this year.
Yeah, and if you notice your team starts out like 0-4, that's when you do what you said before and you make that splash trade. You make that splash trade right then and there. You commit to a retooling, rebuilding. You get the assets like the AJ Brown and a pick for DeAndre Hopkins. You make that. You have to choose. You can't just sit in the middle. If you're the seventh seed, which is a non-playoff seed, the first consolation bracket person, that's the worst spot you can be in.
I did it. My first dynasty. Well, actually, my first dynasty was a writers' league with Tyler Gunther and John Bosch, and I actually won that league year 1 and 2, which was awesome.
All right.
And then my first dynasty league I got into after that, I sat in 6th place 3 years in a row, and I'm like, this is horrible. I got the 107. I don't want this. This is the worst. So I was like, I lost first round of the playoffs, and I'm like, I got to figure out how to do this. So I started. Twitter's fantastic for great minds and listening to different podcasts. I usually try to listen to 8 to 10 different podcasts to get different ideas and different approaches. And I heard about somebody talking about a rebuild, and I'm like, well, I didn't really think of that. I thought we just make a trade here or there. And I was like, I got to get into this. And I took a team. That team was, you played 2 games a week. I went 0-24 to the next year. I went 22-2, and I won the championship. And it was like, hey, I'll take that money,
Yeah, and a lot of people need to realize too is that sometimes you just need that 1 year retool.
Yeah.
You don't have to. Usually, the 2 to 3 year rebuilds are orphan teams that someone completely destroyed, left it on the side of the curb, and then someone else is coming in to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, and that's the difference of the two terminologies. Rebuild takes it 2 years. A retool, you can be competitive pretty quickly, and that's where the kind of trades we've been talking about work out great for retooling because you're still getting good players. Rebuilding, you almost got to tear it down and get those liquid assets because draft picks are never going to go down in price. Players always will.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, this is actually going back a step, but I do have a question that's off the show sheet, and that is if you're doing more of like a productive struggle or you're sort of trading back and acquiring those like 2021 first round picks, whenever the rookie draft comes around, are you going to look to move some of those picks for known players, or are you going to keep them and sort of take the lottery chance with the rookie picks?
I do not trade any of my rookie picks until the draft. I always hold them because rookie picks have their highest value when you're on the clock, right? We all have rookie fever. People want to get in there. Yeah, I just did one that was in a league that we're talking about where I had 5 firsts and I had the 101. And I would have taken Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He wanted Joe Burrow. So he gave me 109 and 221 firsts. I ended up getting Jerry Jeudy and 2 firsts for and then he took Joe Burrow, So it's like you got to take those things as you go. Then I get back to 105 and I'm like, is anybody interested in this pick? And then I get 10 or 110 and another first to move back 5 spots. And I'm like, I'm just going to keep accumulating this value and left the draft with CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Jerry Jeudy, and I added 3 first round picks, So now instead of 5 this year, I had 2 this year and then I got 5 next year.
Nice. Yeah, that's a nice little building piece to where probably I'm guessing in 2021 you're going to be looking to add a couple more running
Right.
backs and then push.
Yeah. And that's on a rebuilding team. I mean, you have to know when to condense the picks. I mean, you need to know. I love Jonathan Taylor. I talk about Jonathan Taylor all the time. I got him in almost all of my rookie drafts. I'm super. I got 8 shares of him, and I love it because I kept moving up just a little bit. Give a second round pick to move up 3 spots to take him because people believe in that certain area. So sometimes you got to move up if you have conviction about your players. What I'm really telling listeners and other people is once you do this for a while, you start to believe in players, and trust those players. Don't fade on it because someone else tells you they're no good. Like right now I'm seeing a lot of negative things out there on Austin Eckler. I love Austin Eckler, but people are like, fade him because of Tyrod Taylor. I mean, I believe that he's a top-notch running back in this league. And I saw a thing on Twitter the other day. If he caught 50 less passes, he'd be the RB7. Now he's going RB13. It's like things like that. You believe in a guy, have conviction and keep that. Those more.
Yeah. One player that's breaking my heart is Mike Williams with that injury because he's one player that I like. David Montgomery's another player I like. Yep. And then who else? Erskine Jr. is a player that I really, really like. And I actually have him ranked super high and just really excited about his potential with the Vikings.
Yeah, they're talking about putting him in the slot, putting him out wide, and I've gotten him in almost every single startup I've done, because he's cheap right now.
Yeah, and he's someone I need to really make a push. I made a push to trade for him in one league, and this is actually one of my home leagues, and my older brother was just like, nope, I'm holding on to him. And I was like, man, you must have read my stuff on Twitter. I've been talking about him a little bit too much.
They do that all the time. I got a trade offer the other day, and he's like, you told me Ronald Jones is a buy this offseason. I've heard it on the podcast. You want him. And then like it's in the notes of the actual trade. And I'm like, man, that's not right. Using that against me.
So now we're going to go to the off season, which is the reason everybody loves Dynasty. That's the reason I love Dynasty. And the first part is, do you do a certain way that you evaluate your Dynasty teams to see if you need to go into a retool? And I know we've been talking about retooling, rebuilding, but it's something that I'm really passionate about. And I know you're passionate about it, but how do you evaluate your teams?
Well, I like to look at things. I don't look at necessarily wins and losses. MFL has a nice option where you get to see a play all schedule. So you would see if you played every team every week, you can see what your record would have been. I like to look at my core age value. My guys that are in my top 5 or 6 players, are they over 27? Are they in that 23, 24 range like you want? And see where records doesn't always tell things. Could you have won more games if you had player X? And I think you break it down by position, honestly. I mean, I feel like you got to look at things wide receivers so deep, and that's where I'm willing to trade back and accumulate value. That's why I keep talking about insulated trades with wide receivers. Running back, it's that top tier that you really want to get into that area because your RB1, 1 through 12, they have a 54% hit rate year after year. RB2 has a 17% hit rate to get in that RB1 class. So I'm trying to stockpile on those running backs. And I think yours was one of the rosters we went over on the Scott Fishbowl episode, I think. And yours was
robust RB.
Yeah, and that's what I did, and that's what I'm all about right now is like loading up on them running backs, and because the wide receiver value is so good. So right now I'm trying to get those stud running backs, and I'm trying to take the value of the Cortland Suttons, the DJ Charks, the Hollywood Browns, those wide receiver ones on their team that you can get as your wide receiver 3 and really put you over the top. As far as quarterbacks go, this is something that I'm really starting to come around on is like those top 2 tiers. I feel like the top 7 quarterbacks, I have in my rankings is Mahomes, Jackson, Watson, Kyler, Dak, and Wilson, even maybe even Josh Allen and Wentz and Burrow. I'm trying to get those guys. I'm trying to get as many shares of that because once you get to like quarterback, 14, they're all pretty close. 14 to 24 are like right in there. So if you can get 2 guys in that top 12, that's the one position I'm willing to trade up. That's the position where in Superflex, it's such a positional advantage to have 2 of those kind of guys as opposed to, you're either going to get 2 older vets with your Breeze and Brady type or Matt Ryan, or you're going to get 2 guys that aren't quite proven like Drew Lock or Sam Darnold, which they could pay off. But I like to have those safe players when it comes to Superflex.
Yeah, and going back to our point with how the community looks at players, those top 7 quarterbacks are super stable year to year, and I don't see any of them except for I know some people have expressed concerns for like Josh Allen, which he's a separate tier from the first 6, but it's definitely a nice thing to have those assets that you're like, okay, I'm like almost 100% certain that like a Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson, Dak Prescott are going to be stable for the next like 3 years. And that's super nice to have versus having, like you said, a Drew Lock or like even a Baker Mayfield, who I still have him ranked as a top 12 quarterback, but he's one that if he struggles this year, oh my goodness.
Right. I was all on the Baker train, man. I got the Funko Pops. My son's got the jersey. I was all about him. We shouting from the rooftops. He's the QB2 because he breaks the touchdown record. Then he gets Odell Beckham, and it was like, I think the fame got to him a little bit. I think he's hungry this year, and he looks like he's ready for a bounce back. The offensive line got beefed up. I'm excited for what Baker can do, but I have him in that QB 12 to 14 range, and that's an interesting range there because it's like, do you want Locke? Do you want Tua? Do you want those kind of young upside guys? Or are you taking the Matthew Stafford, who I absolutely love, or Matt Ryan if you're in a win now,
or even like a Jared Goff? He's someone I've started to warm up to as well. And one point I wanted to go back to is you mentioned your like top 5 like cornerstone players and looking at their average age, which I actually haven't heard before. And that's a great point because if you're starting to get on that older side and then you have like no depth underneath, oh man, you need to start moving players. You need to go into probably a full rebuild versus if you're more on like the younger side. Like if you're 23, 24, you're perfect. If you're 26, then you have to really evaluate, like, am I going to make a push this year or should I start doing those trades we talked about, those moving down a little bit for those assets that will most likely increase. So I love that.
It's something I'm huge on right now. And when I was on Goat District the other day, they call it a pivot, but it's like taking Dalvin Cook right now and moving off of Dalvin Cook down to Miles Sanders or Josh Jacobs and getting a little bit of value maybe on top, but you're taking a 25, 26-year-old guy who doesn't have a contract, moving down to Josh Jacobs, who's 22 years old. He's got a contract and he looked great his rookie year.
Yeah, that's a great move. So my next question is, do you make any moves before the NFL free agency occurs to put yourself ahead? So some examples that I've talked about in previous podcasts are like trading for Teddy Bridgewater before he signed with the team, or even like I mentioned, my trade for Tom Brady. And I actually traded for both Teddy Bridgewater and Tom Brady in the same league and got them relatively cheap for just because of the ambiguity of their situation. So is that something you look to do?
Yeah, you have to kick the tires there. I mean, I tried it with Ryan Tannehill 2 years ago because I figured he would get a starting job somewhere. Tried it with Teddy Bridgewater. Tried it with Jameis Winston, thinking he might get one here, and that still hasn't panned out. But if something happens to Drew Brees, I mean, in that offense, he could put up huge numbers. So, yeah, it's all about it's a stock market. You buy low, you sell high. And if you can buy, if you bought Ryan Tannehill, you probably could have bought him for 2/3. And right now he's in no man's land. Like nobody's paying a first, but you wouldn't get rid of him for a second. But you at least made out, and you got a quarterback who was a QB1 last year.
Yeah, and for 2021, a nice example could be trading for running backs that end up in the free agent market, because I'm currently working on a series with Dynasty Nerds about predicting where players may end up. And whenever you start looking at all the situations and predicting where you think rookies will end up going, which I talked to Dynasty Price, and he said he probably predicts around 5 rookies to end up getting a starting job somewhere. And so
Oh,
that
wow.
leaves
Yeah.
I think it was 8 teams total for 15 guys. And that even
Yeah.
includes the Kareem Hunts, the Mark Ingrams. I even predicted that Le'Veon Bell probably won't be on the Jets anymore. So it's one of those things that the running backs may be an interesting way if you can get someone I've been sort of warming up on a little bit is a Leonard Fournette. I know a lot of people don't like him, but I
Dude.
don't think it's crazy that he gets a better situation in 2021 and then his value increases and you're still getting
Yeah.
most likely RB1 production this year.
Cream rises to the top. I mean, it always does. And Leonard Fournette is one of 3 quarterbacks to be an RB1 3 years in a row. It's him, it's Zeke, and it's Alvin Kamara. I mean, McCaffrey wasn't his rookie year, but I mean, those guys have been RB1s. And look at those two. The other 2 guys are going top 5, and Leonard Fournette's going 3rd, 4th. I got him in the 5th round of FFPC, and he's been a productive back. We wanted him to be able to catch passes, right? That was the knock on Leonard Fournette. Then he catches 80 passes, and we make fun of it. We're like, well, it was just the perfect storm, and it just kind of worked out for him. Let's say he has a good year, and he's going to be playing for a contract, and Chris Carson fumbles away his job, and Leonard Fournette goes to Seattle. His value's through the roof. It goes to New England. Well, no, let's not talk about New England. That's like no man's land. I want it to be Damian Harris season, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I think Atlanta is an interesting perspective for Leonard Fournette as well. And those are actually the 2 teams I talked about for my article, because I actually did one over Leonard Fournette, is the Atlanta Falcons, which I'm skeptical about Todd Gurley being able to be that guy for 2021 and staying healthy. And then, yeah, if he can go to the Seahawks, oh, man.
Yeah. They're going to run Todd Gurley into the ground this year. I mean, they said 15 to 25 touches, and I feel like they're not worried about the knee. They're worried about winning right now. And I mean, I'm not trying to dehumanize it, but I mean, that's what the business is. I mean, Todd Gurley is going to get a ton of usage this year.
Yeah, he's an interesting buy candidate if any rebuilding or retooling team needs to get rid of him. But if you're a retooling team, hold off. So my last question for you, Mike, and we sort of talked about this a little bit with how you deal with rookie draft picks versus trading them for known players. And you mentioned how you wait until you're on the clock. And if you have a certain conviction for a player like a Jonathan Taylor, you'll end up trading up. So my question is, with these rookie picks, let's say you had 6 rookie picks, something like that. There's actually a league that I do have 6 2021 rookie picks. Ended up trading back like crazy. Yeah. So would you try to more capitalize by getting those early picks for those rookies that are the high end guys that mostly hit higher and then trade away the later ones? Or do the reverse and try to trade away the higher end ones and then draft the lower draft picks?
So I feel like, and so in that particular draft, that was the Dynasty Happy Hour Staff League. I have Godwin, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, AJ Brown at wide receiver, and CeeDee Lamb. So I don't need any wide receivers, and this is a heavy wide receiver class. I'm probably on pace to look like I'll get the 101, 102. So you have to at least, Trevor Lawrence, when he joins this league, is going to be a 2nd round startup pick from his rookie year. Maybe, I hate to say it, maybe even back end of first, because he is the biggest prospect we've had since Andrew Luck. I mean, people are going to go nuts over him. And obviously you got Fields and Lance. I mean, there's a lot of quarterbacks when you're talking Superflex here. It's a great wide receiver class with Jamar Chase, but I feel like you get the most value out of those early picks, but you don't want to let somebody else have Trevor Lawrence. They're going to have to come in and pay up. So I like to take those early ones and at least shop them. But it really goes based off of, I had 101 in 3 leagues. I took Jonathan Taylor in all 3 of them. And because that's the guy I wanted. I still at least listen to offers, see what anybody would say, but they were really weak, and people were going that route. So it's tough. It goes based off your team need. But for me, I want offers for those early picks. But what I like to do is when you get to 110, 111, 112, is target a player that you like on someone's team and be like, does anybody want to get in here? And they try to trade in. So now if you want the 112, you got to give me your 21 first and a player I like, and get some type of wide receiver or some type of running back that's going to help your team this year. So you get two pieces for one, and chances are it's going to be better than the 110, 112.
Yeah, and that's a great point with talking about how you're always looking for trades. That's how you made it was like 120 trades last year,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So always be looking to make trades, and it nothing happens with a trade until everybody hits accept. So there's nothing wrong with the discussion being like, hey, who do you like on my team? I like this guy on your team, or even just something like that. I know there's some arguments on Twitter on, oh, I just want cold offers. Oh, I like to talk. I'm one of those guys that I like to talk. And if someone doesn't like to talk, like I'm in a league with Shane, at Shane is the worst. And he's very much a cold offer guy. And
yeah,
so I don't talk to him because I know he doesn't want it. He just likes the offer. He'll send it back. We've made some crazy trades,
yeah.
but
He's a great guy.
he
You got to
is.
rule number one in all of my when I do my lessons is know your league. Know your guys. I think it's Sal Lito has a black book on all his owners. He was the guy, I heard him on Dynasty Trade Calculator. He was talking about he has this big notebook and it says all the trends of what people do on their teams, how they like to communicate, and use those group me's, those Voxers and all those kind of things for the people that do like that, and there's so many times you see the trade get done in a league, right? Somebody makes a trade and you're like, I would have given more than that. So it's like, don't be that guy who makes a cold offer that's on the low end where you're trading a stud and you didn't at least shop it around the league.
Yeah, great point. And I do agree that Trevor Lawrence is going to be that back into the first, start of the second, because in a recent draft, Joe Burrow was the 2.07.
Yeah.
And Joe Burrow had an amazing year, but Trevor Lawrence has been hyped forever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like the ceiling on Lawrence is higher, but the floor is way higher than Joe Burrow. I mean, the range of outcomes for Joe Burrow, and I talk about it a lot on my podcast. I think he's going to break the rookie touchdown record because of the negative game script there in the Bengals offense and the weapons around him with Boyd and Green and Higgins and Ross and Mixon. I mean, there's so many weapons there. They're going to be last year, Dalton and Finley and Driscoll threw for 24 touchdowns. He could easily throw for 29.
You just reminded me of a sad trade where I sent it 2021 third for Ryan Finley. It was a bad day. But anyways, awesome. I had a blast tonight, Mike. Thank you again for coming on. Do you have any projects or articles that you're currently working on?
I need to get back into the writing. I've been doing so many different podcasts. I've jumped on a dozen in the last 2 weeks because I just love talking football this time of year, and at the Dynasty Dad podcast, we're doing bi-weekly episodes. I just did one with Dynasty Outhouse, one with Scott Connor. Next week I have Peter Howard and stepmom Lauren coming on. So I got some great guests. Pretty excited about that, and it's a little bit more hard hitting, a little bit more talking about dynasty strategy, dynasty theory, just like we were talking about tonight. We didn't talk player X value and player Y value. We talked about how to win. We talked about how to make moves. And I love that from your podcast, and I've been listening to your podcast and, I appreciate what you're doing out there. Dynasty Refinery, we just celebrated our 50th episode. That one's a little bit more like, Jared and I like to have a good time. We're friends in real life and, talk a lot more. We talk a lot more trade strategy on there. We try to talk a lot about trades and be very interactive with Twitter. So I'm always on Twitter. I mean, I see you on there a lot. I'm always on there too. And you guys can find me at Dynasty_DadFF. Hit me up with trade offers, always retweeting polls. And I love it. It's a blast.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely have enjoyed interacting with you on Twitter related to trades because I know we both get tagged on plenty of trades. We actually agree more often than not, which is always a good thing because it's always bad whenever you're the only person saying, get this guy. And you're like, ooh, what did I do?
Yeah, no, you and I are usually in sync. I see that you posted it and I'm like, okay, I'll just retweet it because he said the same thing, like he beat me to it. So yeah, it's fun. I mean, I love engaging with new listeners. I love engaging with just people on Twitter in general because it is such a positive, fantastic community. People build each other up. You go to Ryan McDowell and he'll come on the show and he'll build you up. And I mean, he's huge, right? I mean, Scott Fish, all those guys, they're phenomenal. You say something to them and they're willing to jump on and they're willing to help you out. And I love it. I mean, the Dynasty Twitter is a great place to be.
I completely agree. I joined Dynasty Twitter this last September, and it's been a super welcoming community, and it's pretty crazy. Like I remember I used to tag certain accounts, and then now they follow me on Twitter, and it's like, wow, it's crazy, the community in general, and I completely agree. It's just fantastic to be able to just talk to people, like even to get you on my podcast. That was great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I feel like my Twitter world is combining with my real world now. It's kind of crazy because I actually on my Facebook suggestions for people to, friend list, it was Shane Manila, it was Faith from Dynasty Happy Hour, it was Michael Rishner from it was like 7 of them in a row, and I'm like, wait a second, is somebody like hacking me here? They're like just pushing all the people that I know from Twitter, and it's like, oh man, I love being a part of it.
Awesome. So thank you again for coming on, Mike. Everybody go and follow him on Twitter at Dynasty_DadFF, as well as check out the Dynasty Dad Pod and Dynasty Refinery. And also be looking forward for your next article. Excited for that.
Yeah, for sure.
So everybody make sure to subscribe, rate, and review to the Snake in the Draft podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and let's be snakes this draft season. Sweet.